Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part D. The Untold Stories of the Kingdom of Israel, Chapter 2. The untold story about the war near the Kishon stream and the antecedents and outcomes of Deborah, Barak and Yael's victory over Jabin, king of Canaan, and Sisera, his army commander. The miraculous victory of Deborah, Barak and Yael over Jabin, king of Canaan, and Sisera, the leader of his army, at Harosheth Haggoyim, Harosheth of the nations, is described in Judges 4. This story is special not only in its content and because of the female characters who play a lead role in it, but also because it is followed in chapter 5 by the Song of Deborah, which is based on the events of that battle itself. Here, I argue that the story in chapter 4 was written based on an interpretation of the poetry in chapter 5. If this is indeed true regarding the story of the war near the Kishon stream, it reveals how the original story was formed, and that is of particular importance because this story was later incorporated into the Book of Saviors and thereby reached the Deuteronomistic editors who Judahized the story and integrated it into the broader framework of the Book of Judges. Therefore, this example is of great significance when examining the origin and formation of the other stories of Judges. Moreover, this approach provides a perspective not only on what is told, but also on what is untold, as it reveals the lack of understanding and knowledge held by the Deuteronomistic writers regarding the geography of the Northern Kingdom and its ancient history. Additionally, the placement of this particular event, told of in the story and in the Song of Deborah, within the sequence of events that preceded and followed it, provides evidence of the complete dependence of the Deuteronomistic historiographers on the sources they had and their interpretation of these sources, which, as we will discuss later, were not always accurate. The framework formula of the story in Judges 4 were written exactly according to the usual Deuteronomistic formula. The opening in verses 1 to 3 describes the scene of the children of Israel after the death of Ehud, the punishment that God inflicted on them, and the people's cry to God for help. I'm quoting. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh when Ehud was dead. And Yahweh sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Chatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth Haggoyim. Then the people of Israel cried to Yahweh for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and 20 years he mightily oppressed the children of Israel. End of quote. The ending of the story in verses 23 and 24 describes God's role in defeating the enemy and the salvation he brought to his people. And I'm quoting. So, on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. And the hand of the people of Israel bore harder and harder on Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. End of quote. All the information in these framework formulae, which are part of the Deuteronomistic edit of the ancient story, as came within the Book of Saviors, is taken from the story itself. They reveal nothing new. Clearly, the Judean editors took the information they read in the story itself and incorporated it into the fixed pattern of the opening and closing formula. The information in verse 2 about Yavin, who was the king of Chatzor and whose army leader was Sisera, who resided in Harosheth Haggoyim and had 900 iron chariots, is found within the story itself in verses 7, 13, and 17. But the opening formula there is an expansion and exaggeration whereby Yavin, king of Chatzor, also becomes the king of Canaan and is mentioned in this title both in the opening verses and in the closing verses, and nowhere in the story itself. Yavin is mentioned 3 times as the king of Canaan, once in the opening, in verse 2, which says, "And Yahweh sold them into the hand of Yavin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Chatzor," and twice in the concluding verses, both in verse 24, where it is written that, "And the hand of the people of Israel bore harder and harder on Yavin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Yavin, the king of Canaan." The historiographical writers drew this information from the text known to them describing the battle of the water of Merom in Joshua chapter 11 verses 1 to 15, and the great impression that this story evoked. In particular, verses 1 and 10 to 13 describe the kingship of Yavin, king of Chatzor, and summarize the central position of Chatzor within the words, "For Chatzor formerly was the head of all those kingdoms." Thus, I assume that not only were the framework formulae in Judges 4 and the description of Yavin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Chatzor in verse 2, elaborated based on this description, but also the relationship between Yavin and Hever the Canaanite was expanded upon on this basis as well, for there was peace between Yavin, the king of Chatzor, and the house of Hever the Canaanite, and this is from verse 17b. Based on the same information, the concluding formula was also summarized as follows. "So on that day, God subdued Yavin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. And the hand of the people of Israel bore harder and harder on Yavin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Yavin, king of Canaan." Again, these are verses 23 and 24. Beyond that, in the Deuteronomistic editorial framework, there is an insertion of all the events described in the story into historiographical frame of the book of Judges. The story is no longer that Sisera's army pressed and burdened a tribe or local tribes in the Jezreel Valley area, where later they organized and defeated him, but there is a theological explanation with which lies the expansion of the war to all of Israel. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. The same theological explanation also makes the story a part of the chain of stories described in the book of Judges, whereby, in order to emphasize this, the link to the days of the reign of the previous judge is added in the opening formula. "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of God when Ehud was dead." The formula also frames the pressure from Sisera's army as punishment from God for Israel's sin, and start the story through this cry of the Israelites to God because of the punishment he brought upon them. Then the people of Israel cried to Yahweh for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and 20 years he mightily oppressed the children of Israel. The same formula also stressed that ultimately salvation comes from the hands of God. Quoting, "So on that day God subdued Yavin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel." Likewise, it is emphasized that the relationship between the extent of the enslavement and the magnitude of salvation, "And the hand of the people of Israel bore harder and harder on Yavin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Yavin, king of Canaan." In the story itself, Three heroes appear, each playing the role in the designated place. None of them saved the Israelites, and each of them added their limited part of the salvation, which ultimately came from the hand of God, with the concluding verses finally explicitly stating that God alone was a savior. Moreover, this story is special in that it lacks the usual formula of establishing the savior. Indeed, this is intended to emphasize the question: who is the savior? Deborah is presented as prophetess to whom the Israelites used to come up to her for judgment. It's verse 5. She is the one who appoints Barak as the one who will save the Israelites, but Barak renounces the glory of victory and conditions his recruitment to battle on Deborah joining him. It seemed that salvation destined to divide between the two. But Deborah's words in verse 9, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Eliminate this possibility. In the first stage, it seems that this refers to Deborah herself, and she does join Barak. But at the end of the story, it turns out that the prophecy was much more sophisticated, and regardless, at this point, Deborah, who was the lead character at the beginning of the story from verse 4 to verse 10, disappears. She totally disappeared from the story, never to be mentioned again except for the quotation of her words encouraging Barak to go to battle in verse 14. This is the stage in verses 12 to 16 where Barak becomes the undisputed hero of the story and its main character, following a long overlap with Deborah in the previous units of the story. After the encouragement, she is encouraging him to go into the battle and disappears from the story, it seems obvious that he would be revealed as the savior. Barak's ascent to Mount Tabor is the reason for Sisera's army gathering at the Kishon stream. This is in verses 12 and 13, and I'm quoting. When Sisera was told that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, and Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Haggoyim to the Kishon stream. End of quote. As a result, Barak led the army towards the battle with the vigorous encouragement of Deborah. This is in verse 14. And Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day in which Yahweh has given Sisera into your hand. Does not Yahweh go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. However, the continuation of the description eliminates the possibility of a real battle between the two armies and indicates that God is a savior. He is the one who stunned Sisera's camp, caused them to flee, abolished them all, and left only the pursuit to Barak and his army. In verses 15 and 16, it said, I'm reading, And Yahweh discomfited Sisera and all his chariots and all his host with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on his feet. And Barak pursued the chariots and the host unto Harosheth Haggoyim, and all the host of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. There was not a man left. Yet, while Barak is mentioned in most of the stages of the war, he is always in the shadow of a female figure, one who is stronger than him. Deborah is the one who encourages him to go to war, and Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenites, is the one who ultimately kills Sisera, who is being pursued by Barak. Indeed, the feminist trends in this narrative cannot be missed. This account contributes to the key role of women in the book of Judges, alongside the role of Yiftach's daughter, Delilah in the story of Samson, and the story of the Levite's concubine in Gibeah. The allusion to Yael's appearance was already planted before the description of the preparation and the description of the battle, where in verse 11 there is a comment, seemingly casual, about the fact that now Hever the Canaanite had departed himself from the Kenites, the descendants of Chovav, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak in Tza'ananim, which is near Kadesh. However, Yael appears again only after Sisera's escape, when another important detail is given about Hever the Canaanite, which is also the reason why Sisera flees in that direction. And I'm reading from verse 17. But Sisera fled away on his feet to the tent of Jael, the wife of Hever the Canaanites, for there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hatzor, and the house of Hever the Canaanites. This is the stage where the story reached its climax, with a difficult description which we will try to understand and clarify in a few minutes about the way in which Jael killed Sisera. And I'm reading from verse 18 to 21. Very different, very difficult description. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me. Have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said unto her, "Give me, I pray thee, a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, "Stand at the door of the tent, and it shall be, if any man comes and inquire of thee, Is there any man there here? Then you shall say, No. But Jael, the wife of Hever, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her right hand and went softly to him and smote the peg into his temple till it went down into the ground, as he was lying fast asleep and weary. So he died. At this point, there is short overlap between Jael and Barak, seemingly to the overlap at the beginning of the story between Barak and Deborah. And I'm reading from verse 22. And behold, as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking. So he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead, with the tent peg in his temple. This is rather abrupt ending of the story and transition to the Deuteronomistic ending formula that seals it. The conclusion is that the three heroes in the story act according to a divine plan, each playing the individual role. Deborah acts until the battle, then disappears. Barak organizes the Israelite army before the battle and acts in the pursuit after the battle, but he is not important in the battle itself, and he also fails in the pursuit of Sisera. And throughout, he is under the protection of a stronger female figure who activates him or works for him. Given this understanding of the structure and content of the story, the question arises, what is its source? My assumption, following other researchers, is that the story is based entirely on the poetry, Deborah's song in chapter 5. It was built on the basis of the author's understanding of the poetry, absorbing from it and basic principles with some changes, additions, and a lot of filling in the gaps. As I will proceed to show, most of the sections of the story are an interpretation of the few descriptions and individual details found in Deborah's song, mainly involving the second part, verses 17 onward, describing the meeting between Yael and Sisera and as the incident of Sisera's killing. It's important to mention here that poetry is not a historical story. Rather, it's a literary genre of a hymn of gratitude to God, which glorifies him for his victories and achievements. Nor is Deborah's song in chapter 5 epic poetry, which would describe God's actions and refer to the heroic deeds of humans, God representatives on earth. The poetry is not interested in detailing the events, but rather thanks God, and in the process sometimes alludes to various events that emphasizes his power and achievements. The main purpose of the poetry is to convey the personal and national experience of gratitude to God. The combination of the author's excited calls, appeals to God, and a random mention of events, probably events that were known and recognized at the time of the poetry when it was composed. It indicates the personal aspect of the poetry and the author's desire to thank God. This is a psalm of praise and gratitude to God for the salvation he brought to his people, and although in various parts God is not mentioned, his central role is expressed in the opening, closing, and transitions between the various scenes. You can find God in verses 2 to 5, 11, 23, and 31. Many studies have been written about the various textual problems in this ancient poetry, and the starting point is that its opening and ending are editorial additions by the Deuteronomistic editor of the book of Judges, who both added a title to the poetry. I'm reading from verse 1. Then sang Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on that day, and gave it a uniform Deuteronomistic framework together with a story that was added before it in chapter 4. Thus, the definition was added at the end of chapter 5, I'm reading from verse 31, and the land had rest for 40 years. Another central addition to Deborah's song is the listing of all the tribes in verses 14 to 17, an addition that most scholars assume was intended to transform the local and ancient poetry, which referred to the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, who took real part in the battle and were in the story's core, into a national poetry in which all the tribes appear except for the tribe of Judah, which is not a part of the story and was not part of the tribes that were included in the ancient kingdom of Israel. The structure of the poetry includes a long opening, verses 2 to 5, which contains an introduction to the revelation of God and a description of the revelation itself. This is an example of ancient poetry at its peak, a masterpiece of poetry that was already revered by many from ancient times, one in which the God of Israel holds a central place. The continuation of the opening in verses 6 and 7 describes the pressure from the enemies, which made it impossible to walk on the main roads, making it impossible to exist without fortifications, a situation that lasted for an unknown period until Deborah arose. This is the introduction to the war described later. This period was described in the poetry as follows. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anat, in the days of Yael, caravan scenes to travels kept to the byways. Onward existence ceased. It ceased in Israel until I arose. Deborah arose a mother in Israel. From here on, 5 scenes provide a picture of the war, each of which opens with the word then. The first scene in verses 8 to 11a, the first part of verse 11, explains the situation. Because the people of Israel sinned, they had to fight at the city gates. In the poetic language, sin and punishment are presented as follows. When they chose new gods, then war came to the city gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless Yahweh. You who ride on tiny asses, sitting on your saddle blankets, and you who walk along the road, consider, to the sound of musicians at the watering places, there they recite that righteous acts of Yahweh, the righteousness of his unworld existence in Israel. The second scene in verses 11b and 12 describes the departure from the gates to the battle under the patronage and encouragement of Deborah and under the leadership of Barak. Then, down to the gates marched the people of Yahweh. Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake. Utter a song. Arise, Barak. Lead away your captives, O son of Abinoam. The third scene in verses 13 and 18 describes the descent to a settlement called Sarid. Literally, the place is remnant. Apparently, we should locate it in Tel Shadud, near Kibbutz Sarid in the Jezreel Valley. Then, down to Sarid, the nobles, the people of Yahweh, marched down to me with the mighty. The people of Zebulun risked their very lives. So did Naphtali on the heights of the field. Most scholars agree that between these two verses, 13 and 18, late addition was inserted, including verses 14, 15, 16, and 17, in which the rest of the tribes of Israel were added to the tribes of Zvulun and Naphtali, which were mentioned in the original Deborah's song. Note again that the tribe of Judah is not included among the tribes mentioned in this addition, and I think that this is part of the addition that is still part of the Book of Saviors, pre-Deuteronomistic. The fourth scene in verses 19 to 21 describe the preparation of the Canaanites against the Israelites and the battle fought by the Kishon. In ancient poetic language, it sounds like this. Kings came, they fought. Then the kings of Canaan fought at Taanach by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. From the heavens fought the stars. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The stream of Kishon swept them away, the ancient stream, the stream of Kishon. March on, my soul, with might. The fifth and last picture is the most extensive and detailed, from verse 22 to 31, and describes the surrender of Israel's enemy and the death of Sisera, emphasizing the great victory of salvation. Then, loud beat of horses, hoofs with the galloping of his steeds. Curse Meroz, say the angel of Yahweh, curse bitterly its inhabitants, because they came not to the help of Yahweh, against the mighty. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Hever the Canaanite. Most blessed the tent-dwelling women. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell. There he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she cried out, "Why is his chariot so long in his coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed? The wisest of her ladies answer her. Indeed, she keeps saying to herself, are they not finding and dividing the spoils? A maiden or two for every man, colorful garments and plunder for Sisera, colorful garments, embroidered, highly embroidered garments for my neck, all this is plunder? So may all your enemies perish, Yahweh. But may they who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength. If we try to understand the story which emerges from Deborah's song and reconstruct the reality it is based on, it seems that the starting point was the pressure on the Israelites who could not feel safe in their settlements, in the fields and on the roads. And this was understood and explained as being the result of religious sin. This was the stage when the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali prepared for war in Sarid, led by Barak and encouraged by Deborah. Meanwhile, Sisera's army was preparing its attack at Ta'anach by the waters of Megiddo. Sisera's army attacked with its chariots, and the Israelites countered from Sarid. The battle took place near the Kishon stream, which overflowed. This is the stage where Deborah's song features a curse on Meroz, apparently a city in the area of the battle, perhaps one of the cities that belonged to the tribe of Zvulun, because it didn't participate in the battle. At the same time, the poetry describes the mother of Sisera who sits at the window and waits in vain for her son's return. The battle ends with the victory of the tribes of Israel, with the escape of Sisera's army, and with Sisera's death at the hands of Jael. Deborah's song ends with a hope for the loss of all enemies of Israel. As stated above, I concur with the many other researchers that the story in chapter 4 was built on the basis of this description of Deborah's song in chapter 5 and received from it the main series of events as interpreted from the poetry, with some changes, additions, and filling in the gaps. This general outline of events that is described in the poetry forms the outline for the description in the story, starting with the description of the Israelite scene in the story. According to the story in chapter 4, verse 1, and the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, which is based on the description of the scene in the poetry in chapter 5, verse 8, when they chose new gods. This continues with the punishment that comes in the story due to these sins in chapter 4, verse 2. And Yahweh saw them, which is based on chapter 5, verse 2. For that the leaders took the lead in Israel. And in the poetry, this is the same, as well as on what they say, caravans seized and travelers kept to the byways, unwalled existence seized. It seized in Israel. This is in verse 6 and 7. The story in chapter 4, verse 4, continues with the introduction of Deborah as a savior. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel at that time. And this is based on Deborah's song in chapter 5, verse 7. Until I arose, Deborah arose a mother in Israel. Deborah's call to Barak in the poetry in chapter 5, verse 12, arise Barak, lead away your captives, O son of Abinoam, is interpreted in the story literally in chapter 4, verse 13. And Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which Yahweh has given Sisera into your hands. So too, the characterization of the tribe of Zebulun and Naphtali in the poetry, chapter 5, verse 18, A tribe that fought in the battle is taken literally. Zevulun is a people that jeopardized their lives to the death. Naphtali too, on the heights of the field. A definition that was also transferred to the story in chapter 4, verse 10. And Barak called Zevulun and Naphtali together to Kadesh. The same literal interpretation also applies to the location of the battle in Deborah's song. In chapter 5, verse 19, at Ta'anach, by the waters of Megiddo, which is interpreted in the story in chapter 4, verse 13, as from Harosheth Haggoyim to Kishon, to the Kishon stream. There are many other examples where it can be demonstrated how much the story is highly dependent on the poetry, and perhaps the best example is in the description of Sisera's death. According to Deborah's song in chapter 5, verse 25, he asked for water and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. In biblical Hebrew, the meaning of Sisera's words, Maim Sha'al, he asked for water, is a request for drink, not necessarily a direct request to drink water. When following Sisera's request for drink, he was given milk. In the story, things are given a literal meaning. He asked water is interpreted literally. Give me, I pray thee, a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. This is in chapter 4, verse 19. Jael's actions in the poetry, she gave him milk in a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk, were also interpreted literally in the story. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink. Furthermore, the killing of Sisera by Jael is also interpreted almost literally. The description in Deborah's song, chapter 5, verse 26, includes a parallelism, double description of the same action. I'm reading. But Jael, the wife of Hever, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and smote the peg into his temple till it went down into the ground. This overlapping description of the same action, Jael took a tent peg and took a hammer in her right hand, also mirrors the description of the blow to Sisera's head, which includes 4 parallel verbs: struck, crushed, shattered, and pierced. But the story, whose authors sought to interpret the poetry simply and stick closely to the literal description, probably because they all know the poetry, describes the use of 2 different tools in 2 different hands, the tent peg and the hammer, with the peg being driven into Sisera's head, likely with the help of the hammer, and we can read it in chapter 4, verse 21. But Jael, the wife of Hever, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and smote the peg into his temple. Further to this, the explanation in the poetry of how Jael was able to kill Sisera after he fell asleep between her legs, this is in chapter 5, verse 27. At her feet he sank, he fell, there he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell, where he sank, there he fell dead. Became in the story, as part of the literal interpretation, a description of the falling of the tent peg or the hammer, because a tent peg is the one that, according to chapter 4, verse 21, went down into the ground as he was lying fast asleep and weary, so he died. There are many other examples of the way in which the story was based on the poetry, interpreted it in a literal way, with various additions according to the author's understanding. And so, for example, the mention of the kings of Canaan in the poetry, chapter 5, verse 19. Kings came, they fought. Then the kings of Canaan fought. This led to the addition of Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Chatzor, and his mention is, of course, linked to the story in Joshua, chapter 11, verse 1 to 10. And so, the status of Chatzor in verse 10, Chatzor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. Finally, the expression went up at his feet, which is mentioned in the story in chapter 4, verse 10, seem to be not necessarily related to the story. Rather, it might be based on what is written in the poetry in chapter 5, verse 15. Into the valley they rushed forth at his feet. Let's talk a bit about history. The event described in Deborah's song is disconnected from any historical context. Its background is unclear, and it is likewise unclear what followed. Was it a local event? A fleeting battle and victory that had no long-term significance? Or was it part of a broader historical process? Additionally ambiguous is the importance and meaning of this single event, although its memory seems to be preserved not only in poetry and in this story based on it, but also in the Psalms, in Psalms 83, which mentions some of the biblical wars and all of Israel's enemies, including Assyria, a testimony to the time it was of its composition. Verse 10 of these Psalms reads, "Do to them as thou didst to Midian, as to Sisera and Jabin at the Kishon stream." Finally, even in the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 9, verse 1, there may be a reference to those ancient days in the prophecy that equates that heroic battle with the Assyrian victories and the conquest of most of the kingdom of Israel, perhaps with a reference to the establishment of the Assyrian provinces of Dor, Megiddo, and Gilad, mentioning the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. In light of the meaning and importance of this single event, which is described in poetry as well as in the story, both in the book of Judges, it seems that it illuminates a short historical period in the Jezreel Valley, an area that is within the territory of two tribes, Naphtali and Zvulun, and where Canaanite cities, probably mainly along the western side of the valley, strengthened and intensified, which threatened these tribes and prevented them from continuing their previous lifestyle. Hence, this might be understood as a struggle between the Canaanite cities in the west of the Jezreel Valley and the tribal elements that lived to the north and to the east of the valley. If this is the case, then it was a battle between different social elements, the urban system and its partners versus the rural and semi-nomadic elements that existed on the fringes of these urban centers. A possible explanation for the process that took place in the region is that following the pressure and strengthening of the Canaanite cities, the tribal elements began to strengthen and consolidate until they managed to capture their forces and began to struggle for power in the region. From an archaeological and chronological perspective, this process parallels the appearance of many rural sites in the 11th century BCE on the margin of the Jezreel Valley, simultaneously with the prosperous and flourishing of the important major cities in the valley itself, Megiddo, Ta'anach, and Yokneam, along with smaller sites such as Afula, Tel Kiri, Tel Shadud, Tel Kashish, and others. The only other battle described in this area, in this early pre-monarchic period, before the establishment of the kingdom of Israel in the region, is that of Saul in the Gilboa. The goal of Saul's war was likely to unite with the tribes of Jezreel Valley and the Galilee and create a continuum between the tribes of Samaria south of the Jezreel Valley and the tribes of the Galilee to the north of it, in facing the Canaanite Philistine urban system. However, the description of Saul's war provides no echo of what was happening around the Jezreel Valley, and the biblical description portrays Saul as having suffered a decisive defeat. If so, Perhaps the historical process that should be restored is that the failure of Saul and his army preceded the victory of the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali. The aim of the Canaanites in the pressure they exerted against the rural population on the edge of the Jezreel Valley was to consolidate their victory after the battle against Saul in the Gilboa. Hence, the victory of the Israelite tribes was unexpected and therefore perceived as glorious. This is also perhaps the reason why the description in the poetry and story in Judges 4 and 5 is of isolated tribes, fighting alone and without backing or connection to the tribes in the central hill country. This reconstruction can explain why the success of the tribes of Zvulun and Naphtali in defeating the Canaanites left such a huge impression on future generations and was commemorated in Deborah's song and following the song also in the story of Deborah and Barak. Quite likely, this battle laid the foundation for the control of the Israelite tribes over the entire region in a process largely unknown to us. Therefore, this battle is considered the war of liberation of the Israelites from the yoke of the Canaanites in the lower Galilee and in the Jezreel Valley region and northern Samaria. If its reconstruction is correct, then the importance and meaning of the battle far exceeded the narrow limits described in the poetry and its aftermaths in the story, thus indicating that what is told here and the information given is a small inkling of what was left untold simply because it was not known. This also indicates that the historical division into stories that belong to the book of Judges, simply because the heroes were defined as judges, as opposed to the stories that were linked to the character of Saul and were concentrated in the book of Samuel, that described the next period in Israel's history, was not the outcome of chronological historical course of event. Rather, this divide reflects a literary decision, which defined the division according to the types of the leaders. If this proposed reconstruction is correct, then of the stories in the book of Judges, at least the story of Deborah and Barak is chronologically later than Saul's battle in the Gilboa area, which is told in the book of Samuel. In the next chapter, we will proceed from the book of Judges on to the book of Samuel, and from Deborah, Barak, and Yael, we will move to Saul, who also emerged as a judge who came to save Israel at a period of distress, but managed to establish his rule and become the first king of Israel, even if, as we saw, probably in the Jezreel Valley he failed. Will present the untold story of why Saul went to war against Nahash the Ammonite in Yavesh Gilad, on which we learn about from a scroll found in a cave in Qumran near the Dead Sea, in which a text was preserved that was omitted from the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, but was well known to those who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and also to Flavius Josephus in his book Antiquities of the Jews. See you in the next chapter.